The frost bit first. It settled on the raw stripes across Ilara's back, a cruel mercy before the sun's ascent. Grey light bled into the eastern sky, painting the hard faces of the gathered townsfolk in shades of bone and ash. The square was silent, save for the rhythmic hiss and crack of the rawhide. Each lash was a punctuation mark in a sermon of shame, delivered by a man whose face she refused to see. She hung from the post, her wrists raw, her vision a blur of dust and worn boot leather. Her shift, once white, now clung to her in ragged, crimson ribbons. They called her property. Defiant. Unclean. The words had been spat like curses yesterday, when Preacher Thorn, his eyes burning with a righteous fire, had decreed her punishment. Jedediah, her claimant, had nodded, his fleshy lips pursed in satisfaction. She was to be made an example. She had refused Jedediah. Refused his grimy hands, his sour breath, his claim on her body and her labor. For that, she was here. The cold air seared her lungs. Each breath a struggle. Her head lolled. She would not scream. It was the only defiance left to her. The whip sang again. A gasp tore through the crowd, quickly stifled. Ilara's knees buckled, the ropes biting deeper. She thought of nothing. Of the wind that used to whip through the prairie grass, free and untamed. Of a life she could barely remember. The sun finally crested the low buildings, its weak rays offering no warmth, only a clearer view of her degradation. The whipper, a burly man named Grimes, spat on his hands, readying for another blow. He paused. A stillness fell over the square, different from before. Not the silence of anticipation, but of apprehension. Heads turned. A figure on horseback, dark against the new light, emerged from the mouth of the main street. He moved with a slow, deliberate pace, the hooves of his dun stallion muffled by the dust. He was tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, a rifle scabbarded beside him. His face was shadowed by the brim of a worn hat, but the set of his jaw was visible, uncompromising. Silence. Complete now. Even Grimes held his breath, the whip dangling. The rider stopped a few paces from the post. His gaze, Ilara felt it even through her haze of pain, swept over her, then to Preacher Thorn, then to Jedediah, who suddenly looked less sure of himself. No one spoke. The stranger's presence was a weight, pressing down on them all. He dismounted, the movement economical, fluid. He was a man of the harsh lands, etched by sun and wind. Older, perhaps, than he looked at first glance, his eyes holding a depth of experience that brooked no argument. He walked towards Preacher Thorn. This woman, the stranger's voice was low, gravelly, yet it carried across the square like a stone dropped into a still pond. What is her transgression? Preacher Thorn puffed himself up, his piety a brittle shield. She is disobedient chattel, sir. Refused her rightful master. An affront to decency and order, he gestured towards Jedediah, who shuffled his feet. The stranger's gaze flicked to Jedediah, then back to Ilara. He took another step, now standing directly before her. She could smell leather, trail dust, something faintly metallic like old blood. She braced for a blow, a judgment. Instead, his gloved hand reached out, not to her, but to the ropes binding her wrists. With a swift, practiced movement, he drew a knife from his belt. The blade flashed. One rope parted, then the other. Ilara sagged, her legs giving way. Before she could fall, an arm like an iron band encircled her waist, holding her up. She was pressed against a hard chest, the rough wool of his coat abrasive against her cheek. She has no master here, the stranger said, his voice unchanged, yet it resonated with an undeniable authority. Jedediah sputtered. She's mine. I paid good coin. The stranger turned his head slightly, his eyes, now visible, cold as river stones. She is my bride, a collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Preacher Thorn's mouth fell open. Jedediah paled. Bride? Thorn stammered. This is an outrage. There's been no banns, no ceremony. The stranger shifted Ilara's weight, pulling her more securely against him. The ceremony is our concern. The banns are my word against any other claim. He looked directly at Jedediah. Do you have another claim? Jedediah, faced with the unyielding presence of the armed man, withered. He stammered, No, if she's spoken for. He backed away, eager to disappear. The stranger's attention returned to Preacher Thorne. She needs tending, it was not a request. He bent, and with surprising gentleness, lifted Elara into his arms. Her head rested against his shoulder. She was barely conscious, a feather-light burden. He turned and walked back to his horse. The crowd parted before him, a silent, fearful wave. He mounted, settling her in front of him, her battered body cradled against his strength. Without a backward glance, he urged the stallion forward, out of the square, away from the town, leaving behind a silence thick with disbelief and the lingering scent of fear. The sun climbed higher, indifferent. She did not know his name. She did not know where they were going. But the rhythmic beat of his heart beneath her ear was a steady counterpoint to the fading echoes of the whip. For the first time in an eternity, the pain in her back was not the only thing she felt. There was also the hard, unyielding support of the arm around her, a bulwark against the world that had tried to break her. She drifted into a darkness that was not entirely unwelcome. The ride was a blur of muted colors and jarring motion, punctuated by the steady rhythm of the horse's gait and the solid presence of the man who held her. Elara drifted in and out of a thin, pain-laced consciousness. Sometimes she felt the sun on her face, sometimes the cool shadow of trees. His arm never wavered. His silence was as vast and unchanging as the landscape they traversed. Hours passed, or perhaps a day. She lost track. The pain in her back was a constant, throbbing fire, but it had dulled from the sharp agony of the whipping post. When the horse finally stopped, the sudden stillness was almost as jarring as the ride itself. She felt herself being lifted, her body protesting with a fresh wave of agony. She squeezed her eyes shut, a faint moan escaping her lips, the first sound she had made. He said nothing. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, a clean, wild scent that was a stark contrast to the stale, close air of the town. She was carried, and then the scent of wood smoke joined the pine. A door creaked open. She was inside. He laid her gently on something soft, a pallet of furs, she thought, by the feel of them. The movement sent shards of pain through her, but she bit down on her lip, stifling another cry. She lay on her stomach, her cheek pressed against the rough fur. She heard him moving about the small space. The clink of metal, the crackle of a fire being tended. The cabin was dim, light filtering through a single, small window covered with greased paper. She could see rough-hewn log walls, a stone fireplace where a low fire now glowed, a crude table and 2 stools. It was stark, primitive, yet it felt safe. Or perhaps, less dangerous than where she had been. He came to her side. She tensed, every muscle screaming in anticipation of more pain, more violation. He knelt. She could feel his presence, a looming shadow. Then, cool water touched her forehead, a damp cloth wiping away the grime and sweat. His touch was surprisingly gentle, impersonal. He moved to her back. She flinched, a small, involuntary movement. He paused. "This will hurt," he said. His voice, still low and gravelly, was the first sound in what felt like an age. It was a statement of fact, not a threat. She nodded against the furs, a tiny movement. The cloth, cool and wet, touched the mangled skin of her back. She gasped, her body arching, but his hand pressed lightly on her shoulder, steadying her. He cleaned the wounds with slow, methodical care. Each touch was agony, yet there was a strange comfort in its thoroughness. He did not rush. He did not speak again. When he was done, he applied a salve that smelled of herbs and something pungent. It stung, then soothed. He covered her back with a piece of clean, homespun cloth, then gently pulled a thick blanket over her. He rose and moved away, back to the fire. She heard him ladle something into a bowl. The smell of warm broth reached her, making her stomach clench with a hunger she hadn't realized she felt. He returned, placing the wooden bowl and a spoon on the floor beside the pallet. "Eat," he said. He retreated to the far side of the cabin, sitting on one of the stools, his back to her, and began to clean his rifle. Elara lay there, listening to the crackle of the fire and the rhythmic click of the cleaning rod. The broth smelled rich. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself up enough to reach the bowl. Her hands trembled as she lifted the spoon. The warm liquid was life itself, seeping into her chilled bones, easing the raw emptiness inside. She ate slowly, each spoonful a victory. When she was finished, she set the bowl aside and lay back down, exhaustion washing over her in a heavy wave. He had not looked at her. He had not asked her name, nor offered his. He had simply acted. He was a man of few words and decisive action. A rescuer. But why? The claim of bride echoed in her mind. A lie, surely. A means to an end. What end, she did not know. What he would expect in return, she could not fathom. Fear, a cold serpent, uncalled in her belly, but it was a different fear now. Not the terror of the whip, but the uncertainty of the unknown. She watched his broad back as he worked, the firelight catching the worn leather of his vest. He was a stranger. A dangerous man, by all accounts, feared by the townsfolk. Yet, he had saved her. He had tended her wounds. He had fed her. She closed her eyes. Sleep pulled at her, a deep, heavy tide. For now, she was sheltered. For now, the pain was bearable. For now, she would simply endure. The silence of the cabin was broken only by the fire and the wind sighing in the pines outside. It was a silence that held questions, but for the first time in so long, it did not hold immediate menace. She slept, a broken thing, in the sanctuary of a feared man's making. Days bled into weeks. The rawness of her back slowly healed, the fiery pain dulling to a persistent ache, then to a landscape of tight, puckered scars. Elara moved carefully, her body a map of remembered agonies. The man, whom she learned was called Silas, remained a creature of routine and silence. He rose before dawn, tended his few animals, the dun stallion, 2 pack mules, a handful of chickens, checked his snares, and spent his days chopping wood, hunting, or simply sitting by the fire, mending tack or sharpening his tools. He spoke little, and never of the town, or of her. He never asked her name. He never referred to his claim of her being his bride. It hung in the air between them, an unspoken, unacknowledged thing. He left food for her, water. He replaced the soiled dressings on her back in the early days with the same impersonal care, until she was able to manage it herself. She watched him. His movements were efficient, his strength apparent in the easy way he handled an axe or drew water from the well. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, missed nothing, yet they rarely lingered on her. He afforded her a peculiar kind of privacy in the small, shared space. He seemed to expect nothing from her. This, more than anything, was unnerving. After the first week, when she could move without whimpering, she began to explore the confines of her world. The cabin was small, but sturdily built. Outside, a small clearing was ringed by towering pines. A stream gurgled nearby. It was an isolated place, a world away from the dust and judgment of the town. She began to do small things. She swept the rough-hewn floor with a branch broom she found propped against the wall. She washed their few bowls and spoons in the stream. She gathered firewood, adding her small contributions to the pile Silas maintained. He never commented, never acknowledged her efforts directly, but he didn't stop her. One morning, she found a patch of wild berries near the stream. She picked them carefully, her fingers stained purple, and left them in a bowl on the table. When Silas came in from his morning tasks, he paused, looked at the berries, then at her. His expression was unreadable. He simply took a few and ate them, a silent acknowledgement. Trust was not a word she understood anymore. It had been beaten out of her, along with her given name, which she no longer spoke, even in her own mind. She was simply a survivor. But a fragile seed of something else began to sprout in the barren soil of her fear. a kind of understanding. He offered her safety, and in return, she offered the quiet currency of her existence, her small efforts to lessen his burdens. One afternoon, he was splitting logs. The axe rose and fell with a powerful, hypnotic rhythm. She sat on a stump, mending a tear in her thin shift with a needle and thread she'd found in a small wooden box. He stopped, leaned the axe against the chopping block, and picked up a smaller hatchet. He selected a piece of kindling-sized wood, and with a few deft strokes, shaped one end into a handle. He walked over to her and held it out. She looked at the hatchet, then at him. His face was, as always, inscrutable. "For the smaller wood," he said. Easier, she hesitated, then reached out and took it. The wood was smooth in her palm. It was a tool. A means of contribution. Perhaps, a means of defense. She looked at him, searching his eyes. "Why?" she whispered, the word raspy from disuse, the first she had spoken directly to him since that first, pain-filled day. His gaze held hers for a moment. "No one should be helpless," he said. Then he turned and went back to his work. Helpless. That was what she had been. Stripped, beaten, displayed. He was teaching her, in his silent way, not to be helpless. She began to use the hatchet, her movements clumsy at first, then gaining confidence. She learned to aim, to strike true. The rhythm of the work was soothing. It was honest. She learned to set snares, watching him, then trying herself. Her first catch, a scrawny rabbit, filled her with a fierce, unfamiliar pride. He had merely nodded when she showed it to him. But later, when they ate the stew she had helped prepare, there was a different quality to the silence between them. Not easy, not yet. But less fraught. She began to mend his clothes, patching worn elbows and reinforcing seams. He would leave a torn shirt on his stool and find it repaired the next day. No words were exchanged. But the thread stitched more than cloth. It stitched a delicate, tentative connection. One evening, a storm blew in. Wind howled through the pines, and rain lashed against the cabin. The fire sputtered. She sat huddled by the hearth, the sounds reminding her of the chaos of her old life. Silas sat opposite, sharpening his knife, his presence a steady anchor in the tumult. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers across the flickering firelight. He said nothing. But in that shared glance, as the storm raged outside, she felt a profound shift. The fear was still there, a shadow in the corners of her mind. But it was no longer all-consuming. Here, in this wild, secluded place, with this silent, formidable man, she was slowly, painstakingly, beginning to heal. The scars on her back were a testament to her past. The calluses forming on her hands were a testament to her present. She was learning to live again, one breath, one task, one shared silence at a time. The first snow had fallen, dusting the pines in white, when the past arrived. Ilara was splitting kindling, the small hatchet a familiar weight in her hand. Silas was further in the woods, checking a line of traps he'd set for winter furs. A sound made her pause, not the usual forest noises, but the crunch of boots on frosted ground, the low murmur of voices. Unfamiliar. Her heart leaped into her throat, a cold fist of dread clenching around it. She straightened, the hatchet held tight. 3 men emerged from the tree line. The foremost was Jedediah, his face florid, his eyes alight with a possessive gleam. Behind him were 2 others, hulking figures she recognized from the town, men who had watched her whipping with avid eyes. Grimes, the whipper, was one of them. Well, Jedediah said, his voice oily. "Found the runaway nest, did we?" "Took some doing." "That savage of yours covers his tracks well." Ilara stood her ground. Her legs trembled, but she locked her knees. The fear was a bitter taste in her mouth, but something else rose with it, a cold, hard anger. She thought of Silas's words, no one should be helpless. She was not the same broken creature they had tormented in the town square. "I am not yours," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, though quiet. It carried in the crisp air. Jedediah laughed, a harsh, barking sound. Still defiant, are we? The savage hasn't tamed you yet, it seems. No matter. Preacher Thorn agrees. You belong in the settlement, under proper authority. Under my authority. Grimes took a step forward, a length of rope coiled in his hand. No need for fuss, girl. Come along quiet. Ilara's grip tightened on the hatchet. I am not going anywhere. She thought of Silas. Where was he? But this was her fight first. She had to stand. Jedediah's smile faded. Don't be foolish. There's 3 of us. He can't protect you forever. He gestured to Grimes. Get her. Grimes advanced, his eyes cold. Ilara raised the hatchet. It was a small weapon against these men, but it was hers. She would not be taken easily. Stay back, she warned. Just as Grimes lunged, a shadow detached itself from the deeper woods. Silas. He moved with the silence of a predator, his rifle held loosely in one hand. He wasn't hurrying, yet he covered the ground with deceptive speed. He stopped a few paces behind and to the side of Ilara, not in front of her. His presence was a sudden, chilling wall. Jedediah and his men froze. Grimes, caught mid-stride, stumbled to a halt. Silas, Jedediah breathed, his bravado deflating like a pricked bladder. Silas's eyes, chips of ice, were fixed on Jedediah. He said nothing. His silence was more menacing than any threat. We just came for what's mine, Silas, Jedediah whined, trying to regain some composure. The town council, Preacher Thorn himself, they sent us. She's a disruptive influence. Ilara spoke, her voice gaining strength as Silas stood near. I was whipped for refusing him. For defending myself. Is that justice, Jedediah? Jedediah flushed. You were property. Disobedient. I am a woman, Ilara stated, clear and firm. Not property. And I choose to stay here. Silas finally spoke, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the cold air. She has made her choice. He took a slight step, aligning himself more fully with her, a silent declaration of solidarity. Jedediah licked his lips, his gaze darting between Ilara's determined face and Silas's implacable one. The 2 thugs behind him shifted uneasily. They knew Silas's reputation. A man who lived by his own laws, who had faced down worse than them and walked away. This ain't lawful, Jedediah blustered, his voice lacking conviction. She's promised to me. She was never promised to you, Ilara corrected, her eyes burning. She was sold to you, like a beast of burden. I will not be sold. I will not be broken again. She looked at Silas. I am not running this time. Silas nodded, a fractional movement. His gaze returned to Jedediah. You heard her. Leave, and if we don't. Grimes challenged, though his eyes betrayed his fear. Silas's hand tightened slightly on his rifle. Then we'll stand. The simple words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken consequences. The 3 men looked at each other. They had come expecting to drag away a lone, terrified woman. They faced instead a woman who had found her steel, backed by a man who was a legend of quiet deadliness. The odds had shifted dramatically. Jedediah's bluster crumbled completely. He was a bully, not a fighter, especially not against a man like Silas. This isn't over, he snarled, but he was already backing away. The town won't stand for this. Grimes and the other man followed him, casting wary glances over their shoulders at Silas. They retreated into the trees, their departure far less confident than their arrival. The sounds of their crashing retreat faded, leaving behind a ringing silence. Ilara slowly lowered the hatchet, her arm trembling from adrenaline. She turned to Silas. His expression was unreadable as ever, but his eyes held a new light, something akin to respect. Thank you, she said, her voice husky. He merely inclined his head. You stood. He looked at the hatchet in her hand. You learned she had. She had faced her tormentors, spoken her truth, and found a strength she hadn't known she possessed. The fear was still there, a residue, but it no longer owned her. The clearing felt different now. No longer just a refuge, but a place she had defended. A place she had chosen. Silas turned and began to walk towards the cabin. Ilara watched him for a moment, then followed. The snow crunched under her boots. The air was cold, but clean. She was no longer just surviving. She was fighting. And with Silas by her side, she was not alone. The confrontation had been a storm, brief and violent, but it had cleared the air, leaving behind a stark, undeniable truth: she would not be a victim again. The winter deepened, blanketing the small homestead in a thick shroud of white. Jedediah and his men did not return. Word, it seemed, had spread. The woman with the feared Silas was not to be trifled with. The incident, though terrifying, had forged a new understanding between Ilara and Silas. The unspoken claim of bride, once a pragmatic lie uttered in a moment of crisis, now resonated with a different, quieter truth. It was not a claim of ownership, but of alliance, of shared sanctuary. Ilara found her voice, not just in defiance, but in daily life. She began to speak more freely, asking Silas about the woods, the animals, the turning of the seasons. He answered in his usual laconic style, but his responses were direct, informative. He taught her to track, to read the signs of the forest. She learned the names of the trees, the calls of the birds. Her world expanded beyond the immediate circle of the cabin. She found a tattered book in Silas's meager belongings, its pages filled with pressed flowers and handwritten notes about herbs and their properties. It was a woman's hand. She wondered about the woman who had made it, about Silas's past, a subject he never broached. But she saw a softness in his eyes sometimes, a fleeting sorrow when he looked at the book, and she did not press. One day, she found him staring at a small, intricately carved wooden bird, its paint faded. He held it with a tenderness that belied his rough exterior. He saw her looking and, for a moment, his guard seemed to drop. "My daughters," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Lost her. And her mother." Fever, the words were stark, painful. He closed his hand around the bird, his face hardening again, but the brief glimpse into his sorrow was a profound offering. It explained the quiet protectiveness, the deep-seated morality. He had failed to save them. He would not fail again. Ilara reached out, her hand resting briefly on his arm. A small touch. An acknowledgement of his pain. He did not pull away. The cycle of victimhood had been broken for Ilara. She was no longer defined by the lash marks on her back, but by the strength in her hands, the clarity in her eyes, the resilience of her spirit. She began to sing sometimes, softly, as she worked, old forgotten melodies surfacing from a past before the darkness. The cabin, once just a shelter, became a home. They worked together, preparing for the long winter, their movements falling into a comfortable rhythm. She repaired the cabin's chinking, while he reinforced the small animal shed. They built a lean-to for firewood, their hands brushing occasionally, sending a jolt of unexpected warmth through her. It was not a spoken love, but a deep, abiding respect, a partnership forged in adversity and strengthened by shared silence and mutual reliance. One crisp morning, as the thaw began to whisper of spring, they were checking snares near the stream. Ilara spotted movement in the undergrowth. Not an animal. A child. A young girl, no more than 7 or 8, thin, ragged, her eyes wide with terror. She was alone. Ilara approached slowly, her heart aching with a familiar pang. "It's all right," she said, her voice gentle. "We won't hurt you." The girl flinched but didn't run. Silas hung back, allowing Ilara to take the lead. Ilara knelt, offering her hand. "What's your name? Are you lost?" The girl whispered a name, Lily, and then burst into tears, stories of a brutal journey and abandonment tumbling out. Ilara gathered the child into her arms, holding her close, murmuring words of comfort. She looked up at Silas, her eyes meeting his. He nodded, understanding dawning. This was the next step. Not just to survive, but to offer sanctuary to another. They brought Lily back to the cabin. Ilara bathed her, tended her scraped knees, and fed her warm stew. The child, exhausted and terrified, clung to her. That night, Lily slept soundly in Ilara's old pallet by the fire, a small, trusting presence in their quiet home. Ilara sat with Silas by the hearth, the fire casting dancing shadows on the log walls. The silence between them was different now, filled with a shared purpose. "She needs a home," Ilara said softly. Silas looked at the sleeping child, then at Ilara. A rare, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of his lips. "We have one," he said. His gaze met hers, and in it, she saw not just protection, but partnership. A future. Ilara, once the whipped, shamed woman, now offered shelter. She had reclaimed her agency, her voice, her very identity, which she now knew was not a name given or taken, but a strength forged in fire and ice. Her name was the resilience in her soul, the compassion in her heart. She was Ilara. She was a survivor. And now, she was a protector. The spring sun rose the next morning, melting the last of the snow, promising new growth. In the small cabin, nestled deep in the woods, a new family, unconventional but strong, faced the dawn. Their life would be quiet, perhaps hard, but it would be their own, built on courage, respect, and an unspoken bond that was more powerful than any vow. The world outside might still be cruel, but within the sanctuary they had built, there was healing, and there was hope. A new beginning, earned not given, under the vast, indifferent sky.